We're now a couple of weeks through lockdown, and the buzzwords in society have changed somewhat. Previously, we were talking about the thought of being isolated and separated and so on, but now our attention in the media is being turned to terms like cure, terms like healing, and the thought really of restoration. And as we continue on in our little set of studies on the names of God, I thought after looking at Jehovah last week, it would be good to come to one of the first that we meet in the Bible, other than the general name Jehovah, and really think about God being Jehovah Ropheka, the Lord our healer, because of the nature of what we're going through and the nature of what everybody is speaking about. In Exodus chapter 15, you are confronted by a wonderful chapter in the Bible. It's really one of the most uplifting chapters of the Bible, and of course we all need uplifted at such a time as this. In Exodus chapter 15, the people of God, they have just come through the Red Sea. They have just seen their enemies thwarted and dealt with, destroyed. Pharaoh, of course, and his armies, they have been destroyed in the Red Sea. And Exodus 15, or most of Exodus 15, it really is comprised of the song of Moses. What Moses sang, his song of deliverance, his song of redemption, you could call it. How the Lord delivered both himself and indeed the probably the 2 million people as they walked through the Red Sea, walked as if they were on dry land, and then arrived safely on the other side. Let's not forget that this was a redeemed people. In Exodus 12, they were redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. And God has now shown himself to be one who protects his own redeemed people in the incidents that have followed and the destruction of all of the people of God's enemies. And against that backdrop, this song then, Moses burst forth into this spontaneous song. And yet we find, as a redeemed people and as a singing people, even a rejoicing people, what happens to the people of God? Well, at the end of Exodus 15, just as they're finishing this song, Moses is finishing this song, you read of them entering the wilderness of Shur. And I think that's very, very interesting, because the term Shur in Hebrew, it has the idea of a wall, it has the idea of them being hemmed in. Really, we could even think of them as being isolated, because that's really what happened. They went through the wilderness for what turned out to be 40 years. So they're hemmed in, they're in this wall experience. And they go 3 days in this wilderness, the wilderness of Shur, in this kind of hemmed in experience. And Exodus 15 tells us that they went 3 days without water. They then come to a location which is interesting. They come to a place named Marah. The term Marah means bitterness, and they had a bitter experience there, because they came to this place Marah and there was water there, but the water was bitter. And in Exodus chapter 15, we have a lovely picture of the gospel. You read in verse 25 of Moses taking a stick and casting this stick into the water. And through the application of that stick or that piece of wood to the water, these bitter waters, they are made sweet, they are cured. And it's a picture of the gospel. It's a picture of what Christ does for us. He takes our sin and he bears it, but he deals with it. He eradicates it, and he makes the bitterness of sin sweet, as it were, in our experience. And he takes we who are stained by sin and corrupted by sin, he takes us and he cleanses us, or to use another term, he cures us, he heals us. And then against that backdrop, then against them drinking of this sweeter, or this sweet water, you then read in Exodus 15 verse 26 of God coming to Moses and revealing himself as Jehovah Ropheka. In verse 26 we read, I am the Lord that healeth thee. And the term Lord there, it's Jehovah Ropheka, the Lord our healer. You don't need me to tell you that at a time where we're suffering a global pandemic, COVID-19, that it's good to think about, good to meditate upon Jehovah Ropheka. Think about God as being our healer. But before we get carried away with God being our healer, let's think just for a few moments about how God actually heals his people. How he is Jehovah Ropheka to us in our experience as we find him here in the Bible. And I want to suggest that there are three ways that God provides healing for his people. The first way that I think we find in the Bible that he provides healing for his people is that he heals them spiritually. The Bible depicts sin in many ways, but it depicts it as a debilitating, as a degrading, and ultimately a damning disease. One example of this that springs to mind is the book of Isaiah and Isaiah chapter 1. They're the people of God. They've turned away from him. They've rebelled against him. And in verse 6, they are described really as a sick patient. You read that there that from the sole of their feet to the top of their heads, they were full of wounds, bruises, and putrefying sores. The thought there is of someone who is diseased and diseased thoroughly. And really what God was saying was that their sin was like a crippling, a deadly disease in their experience. This is what their sin was like before him. And yet what does God do? In the gospel, he heals us from our sin. Through Jesus Christ, through his forgiveness, through the shedding of his blood, there is remission of sins. And that is depicted in the Bible as God healing us spiritually, him dealing with our sin. One verse that springs to mind is Isaiah chapter 53, where we read there that it is by his stripes, verse 5, that we are healed. God deals with our sin through Jesus Christ, and yet it is described there as us being healed. It's not speaking of physical healing there. It's depicting God dealing with our sin as us being healed. So let's never forget that God is Jehovah Ropheka in the fact that he has sent his son to bear, as Isaiah 53 tells us, to bear our sicknesses, to bear our sin, to die on the cross for our deadly, debilitating, and damning sin. So one of the ways that God heals you is spiritually, through the application of his son's blood to you, where he cleanses you. He heals you spiritually. But he also heals physically. Sometimes in evangelical circles we shy away from this, but God is depicted as Jehovah Ropheka, as one who heals his people physically. Does he do this all of the time? No, unfortunately he doesn't. But nonetheless, he is Jehovah Ropheka. He is the Lord our healer. And he does provide physical healing. Good to remember that, especially at a time when many people are impacted and they are confronted by disease on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis. God is our healer. In Psalm 103, we read of him not only redeeming us from our iniquities, but he is also described as one who, verse 3, heals our diseases. One who heals our diseases. Again, in James chapter 5, we are told that the prayer of faith, it saves the sick. And the thought there is of God's people praying that God would give wisdom, that God would apply medicine or whatever has been applied, and that he would use that for his glory, and that he would raise up, as to use the language of James 5, that he would raise up the sick from their sick bed. Again in 3 John, you read John, an older man, and he's writing to the church at Ephesus, and in verse 2 you read of him wishing that they would be, that they would prosper, that they would physically prosper, and that they would be in health. Again, he's wishing that they would be in good physical health. And so again, God is Jehovah Ropheka in that he does give doctors wisdom, he does use doctors, he does use medicine, and at times even miraculously he does intervene and provide physical healing. Let's remember that at such a critical, crucial time. that God would give those who are in charge, in office, wisdom, that He would give health ministers wisdom, health secretaries wisdom as to when to lift this ban and so on. He would give them wisdom in terms of testing, and that God would even use the application of medicine and so on to the preservation of life and the restoration of individuals as well. So God is Jehovah Ropheka. He does heal spiritually and physically. There's another way, which again at times we can overlook in evangelical circles in the Church of Christ, that God heals. That is that God does heal emotionally as well. There are times when you enter an experience and it does leave a scar, and it can even leave you mentally ill. And yet, in Psalm 147 verse 3, we read, He healeth the broken in heart, He bindeth up their wounds. He healeth the broken in heart, and He bindeth up their wounds. And the picture thereof is of God being as it were, a doctor. And He comes and he sees those who are broken in heart. What does He do? He binds up that broken heart. There's no physical wounding there. It's an emotional issue, that they're broken in heart. And He comes, and as the doctor applies his medicine and so on, God is that spiritual doctor, that great physician, and He provides emotional healing. There may be those, and you're struggling emotionally with COVID-19. You struggle with being hemmed into the house, with maybe not seeing family, being detached from society, detached from the church family. Remember that God is one who heals the broken in heart. So, God is Jehovah Ropheka, the Lord our healer, and let's not forget that during COVID-19.